MBA from Harvard. You'll understand." That's what HR said while sliding the printed offer letter across that cheap laminate table. I'm Russell Patterson, 48 years old, and I'd just been told why a 26-year-old kid was worth 60% more than me after I'd spent 11 years keeping their production lines running. One line on that paper told me everything about how this company really worked. Senior process control engineer, 11 years experience, compensation aligned with internal equity guidelines. Internal equity apparently meant I was being paid less than the management trainee I'd just finished teaching about SCADA systems. "Accept it or leave," Linda Stevens from HR repeated, not looking at me, just checking boxes on her clipboard so she could move on to her next task. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't mention the plant shutdowns I'd prevented or the EPA violations I'd helped them avoid. I just pulled out a single sheet of paper I'd brought with me, my resignation letter, already signed and dated. Slid it back across the table with a smile. Effective 12:45 p.m. "Today," I said. By 12:47, my badge was deactivated. By 12:52, my SCADA access was revoked. By 1:15, Diana Foster, the CEO's assistant, was running across the employee parking lot in high heels, waving her arms and shouting my name like the plant was on fire. By 3 p.m., 9 people were sitting in an emergency crisis meeting, staring at an incident report that started with my resignation timestamp and ended with the words "critical production shutdown" and estimated impact, $32 million in lost output. But let me back up and tell you how a quiet, underpaid engineer became the most expensive lesson in his company's history just by walking away. I'm Russell Patterson. Most people at the plant called me Russ because there were always too many guys with regular names in manufacturing. I'm 48 years old, spent the last 22 years keeping industrial systems from failing when lives and millions of dollars were on the line. I didn't come up the corporate way. No fancy degree from some elite school. Got my engineering degree from a state university you probably never heard of unless you grew up within 50 miles of it. Before that, I spent 6 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, working on dam control systems and water treatment facilities, where a mistake could flood towns or poison water supplies. After the Army, I bounced through a couple smaller industrial shops before landing at Apex Manufacturing 11 years ago. They made specialty chemicals for automotive and aerospace companies, the kind of operation where everything had to be perfect because a contaminated batch could ground airplanes or kill engines. When I started, Apex was still family-owned and run by engineers who understood that uptime meant everything. We had a 1970s-era control system that somehow kept working because a few old-timers knew every quirk and workaround. I made myself useful by volunteering for weekend maintenance calls and taking the emergency shutdowns nobody else wanted to troubleshoot. People started saying, "Call Russ. He'll figure it out." At first it was because I was new and eager. Later it became standard operating procedure. I still remember my first major save, Memorial Day weekend, 2014. The primary reactor's temperature control started spiking during a critical batch run. We had 48 hours of product worth $800,000 that would be worthless if the temperature variance exceeded specifications. I traced the problem to a failing sensor that everyone assumed was reading correctly and jury-rigged a bypass that kept the batch within spec. The plant manager sent a company-wide email. Russ saved our Memorial Day weekend and probably our Q2 numbers. That was the job. Keep the processes running so the company could make money and keep people employed. Over the years, my role expanded. Process engineer to senior engineer to control systems specialist, though HR always found ways to keep my title just below the pay grades that would force them to update their salary bands. I didn't mind, as long as I had access to the systems that kept everything safe and productive. I rebuilt the HMI interfaces, designed the alarm management protocols, wrote the maintenance procedures that operators used when sensors failed at 2 a.m. on Sunday. I learned every failure mode not from textbooks, but from actual emergencies. The time a power surge took out half our PLCs during a storm. The time a contractor cut through a control cable and nearly caused a chemical release. The time someone from corporate tried to optimize our safety interlocks without understanding why they existed. I kept detailed logs because that's what you do in industrial settings. Everything documented, every anomaly recorded, every near miss analyzed. When the system hiccups, you need to know if it's random or part of a pattern that could kill someone. Then Apex got bought by Sterling Industrial Group, a private equity firm that specialized in operational excellence. They brought in Bruce Morrison as CEO, a guy who'd made his reputation modernizing legacy manufacturing operations. He talked constantly about Industry 4.0, digital transformation, and eliminating tribal knowledge through systematized processes. The new management philosophy came with new people. Harvard and Wharton MBAs who could build beautiful spreadsheets about efficiency metrics but had never worked a 16-hour shift to keep a reactor from overheating. They loved talking about smart manufacturing and predictive analytics while the rest of us kept the actual manufacturing running. The warning signs started when they launched an operational excellence leadership program for high-potential emerging talent. Translation: recent graduates from prestigious business schools who would rotate through different departments to gain exposure before taking on strategic roles. One of them was Jordan Martinez, 26 years old, Harvard MBA, with an industrial engineering minor he'd squeezed in between consulting case competitions. Smart in the academic way that gets you good grades but doesn't teach you what to do when a PLC starts throwing fault codes at midnight. They started him as process optimization analyst. Within 6 months, senior process manager. Within 9 months, director of manufacturing excellence. He had direct access to Bruce and to control systems he didn't understand because someone thought it would be developmental for him to own cross-functional improvement initiatives. Jordan loved making presentations about digitizing manual processes and leveraging IoT sensors for real-time optimization. He'd never been on the floor during an emergency, but he had strong opinions about our outdated approaches and resistance to change. The real kick in the teeth came when Jordan posted an internal analysis comparing legacy engineering compensation to market rates for strategic manufacturing roles. He'd supposedly anonymized the data, but when there's only one guy with 11 years of control systems experience, anonymization is a joke. That's when I saw it in black and white. My total compensation was barely higher than what the leadership program graduates were getting as starting salaries. Jordan specifically was making 60% more than me to create PowerPoint presentations about systems I'd designed and maintained. I started keeping better records after that. Not just technical logs, but documentation of every suggestion I'd made that got ignored, every process improvement that got delayed because it wasn't strategic enough, every near miss that could have been prevented if someone had listened to the guy who actually understood how things worked. The breaking point came 3 months later in that windowless HR conference room. My wife Sarah had been researching colleges with our daughter Emily, who's a senior looking at engineering programs that cost $60,000 per year. We've got 12 years left on our mortgage, and Sarah's health insurance comes through my job because of her diabetes. "Russell," Linda said, forcing herself to look at me after sliding that compensation letter across the table. "We've completed our annual review process. We're adjusting your compensation to align with internal equity guidelines. The adjustment was 2.5%. In a year when inflation was running over 6%. Internal equity guidelines?" I asked. "We have to maintain consistency across the organization. The leadership development participants have different educational backgrounds that command higher market premiums." "Harvard MBAs," I said. She nodded reluctantly. Their credentials open different career trajectories. And my credentials? You have significant tenure here. Institutional knowledge, job security. She paused. But the market for traditional engineering roles has evolved. Traditional engineering roles, like keeping chemical plants from exploding, with some kind of outdated skill set. So my options are accept this or leave. Those are your options, yes. I'd been expecting this conversation since Jordan's compensation analysis went around. I pulled my resignation letter from the folder I'd brought and placed it where her offer had been. I choose leave, I said, signing my name with the pen I'd used to sign off on safety procedures for 11 years. Effective 12:45 p.m. today. Linda stared at my resignation letter like I'd just pulled the pin on a live grenade. You don't have to decide right now, she said quickly. Think about it over the weekend. We can revisit the compensation discussion. No, I said. You just told me exactly how this company values me compared to a kid who's never worked a night shift or troubleshot a failing reactor. I believe you. Will you at least stay through the end of the month? Help with knowledge transfer? I smiled, and for the first time in months it felt genuine. My procedures are documented. My maintenance logs are current. The safety protocols I wrote are in the system. Everything's ready for someone else to take over. What I didn't mention was that documented doesn't mean understood. You can write down that Reactor 3's pressure relief valve sticks at 847 psi and needs a specific sequence to reset. But knowing that fact, and knowing how to handle it at 2 a.m. when alarms are screaming, are completely different things. At 12:45, my badge stopped working. I packed my coffee thermos, my safety glasses, and the notebook that mattered more than anything else. My incident log. 11 years of equipment failures, near misses, and if this happens again, try this first notes that never made it into the official documentation because the official system wasn't built for the weird edge cases that could shut down a plant. I walked through the control room one last time. Mark Sullivan, the senior operator, looked up from the HMY screens I'd redesigned 3 years earlier. Heard you're leaving, Russ. This place won't be the same. You'll be fine, I said. Just follow the procedures and call engineering if anything looks weird. What I didn't say was that engineering now consisted of Jordan Martinez and 2 recent graduates who'd never seen what happened when a batch crystallization went wrong, or why you never bypass the emergency cooling interlocks, even when production is behind schedule. I walked past the break room where second shift was getting briefed on the evening's production run. Past the maintenance shop where Joe Kowalski was rebuilding a pump that had been acting up for weeks. Past the raw materials warehouse where everything looked normal, but where I knew half the level sensors were running on manual calibration because the automatic system had never been properly commissioned. At 12:47, my computer access died. At 12:52, my phone stopped connecting to the plant network. At 12:58, I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot when the first alarm came through on the emergency notification system that still had my personal cell phone number. Level 2. Process alarm. Reactor 3. Pressure deviation. All qualified personnel report to control room. I sat there for a moment, engine running, looking at the text message. Reactor 3. The one with the sticky relief valve and the temperamental pressure transmitter that read 15 psi high when the ambient temperature was above 78 degrees. It was 82 degrees today. My phone buzzed again. Mark Sullivan, texting from his personal phone. Russ, you still in the lot? R3 pressure spiking and Jordan's trying to remote reset the interlocks. Can you come back for 5 minutes? I typed back, I don't work there anymore. Follow emergency procedure EP003. Can't find EP003 in the system. That's because EP003 was the procedure I'd written after the near miss in 2019, when a similar pressure spike had almost triggered an emergency venting that would have cost us $400,000 in product and brought the EPA down on us. I'd submitted it to the documentation system, but it had gotten stuck in the approval process because Jordan thought it was too reactive and wanted to focus on proactive solutions. I put the truck in reverse and drove toward the main gate. In my rearview mirror, I could see people in hard hats and high-vis vests converging on the main building. The emergency lighting was starting to flash. At 1:05, I was pulling onto the highway when my phone rang. Scott Williams, the CFO. Russell, thank God. We need you to come back right now. There's a situation with Reactor 3, and the engineering team needs your expertise. I resigned, Scott, effective 12:45. I know, but this is an emergency. We're looking at a potential product loss situation. What's the current status? Jordan says the pressure relief system is malfunctioning and the automated controls aren't responding properly. He's trying to implement a manual override. I pulled over to the side of the highway. Scott, listen to me very carefully. Do not let Jordan override the emergency interlocks. That reactor has a known issue with pressure transmitter calibration that makes the readings look worse than they are. Can you walk him through the fix? The fix is in procedure EP003, which should be in your document management system. He can't find it. Then he needs to call maintenance to manually check the actual pressure gauge on the reactor vessel and compare it to the control room reading. If there's a 15 psi difference, he needs to adjust the alarm set point in the DCS and restart the cooling sequence. There was a pause. Can you just come back and handle this? We'll pay you for the day. Scott, I'm done being your single point of failure. You've got procedures, you've got engineers, and you've got operators who know their equipment. Figure it out. I hung up and got back on the highway. At 1:22, the emergency notification system sent out a Level 3 alert. Plant-wide production hold. Reactor 3. Emergency shutdown. Non-essential personnel clear area. At 1:30, my phone started buzzing with texts from guys on the floor. Mark. They shut down R3. Batch is ruined. Jordan called corporate. Joe from maintenance. Whatever you did, good for you. They're running around like chickens with their heads cut off. At 1:35, Diana Foster called. Russell, Bruce needs to speak with you immediately. We have a plant emergency and you're the only one who understands the Reactor 3 control logic. I don't work there anymore, Diana. This isn't about employment. This is about safety and regulatory compliance. We could be looking at an EPA reportable incident. That got my attention. Not because I wanted to help Sterling Industrial Group, but because an EPA incident would mean investigations, fines, and potentially criminal liability for whoever was in charge of the safety systems. If people got hurt because of negligent engineering decisions, that was serious. What exactly happened? Jordan attempted to override the emergency interlocks when the pressure alarms activated. Something went wrong, and now the reactor is in emergency shutdown mode. We can't restart it, and we have a $800,000 batch that's crystallizing in the wrong configuration. I closed my eyes. Of course he'd tried to override the interlocks. That was exactly what someone would do if they thought the alarms were false and they were under pressure to keep production running. Diana, the reactor is designed to fail safe. If it's in emergency shutdown, there's a reason. You need to bring in a chemical process safety consultant to evaluate the situation before you try to restart anything. How long will that take? Days. Maybe weeks if they find evidence that safety systems were improperly overridden. Russell, please, can you at least consult on this? We'll pay whatever rate you want. I thought about my daughter Emily, who'd gotten her acceptance letter from Purdue's engineering program last week. I thought about Sarah's insulin costs, and our mortgage payment, and the secure job I'd just walked away from. Then I thought about Jordan Martinez, who'd spent 9 months learning just enough to be dangerous, and who'd apparently decided that 11 years of operational experience could be replaced by an MBA and some PowerPoint slides about digital transformation. Diana, you can hire me as a consultant through my new employer. We bill at $350 per hour, with a 40-hour minimum for emergency response calls. Your new employer? I start at Consolidated Chemical on Monday. They've been trying to recruit me for 2 years. Turns out they pay market rates for people who actually know how to keep chemical plants running safely. I hung up and drove home to tell Sarah we were going to be just fine. By the time I got home, Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee and scrolling through Emily's college financial aid applications on her laptop. She looked up when I walked in at 2:15 in the afternoon, 3 hours earlier than usual. "How'd the compensation meeting go?" she asked, though my expression probably already gave her the answer. "I quit," I said, sitting down at our kitchen table. "Effective today." She closed the laptop slowly. "What happened?" I told her about the 2.5% raise, about Jordan making 60% more than me to create PowerPoint presentations about systems I'd built, about Linda explaining that MBA credentials commanded higher market value than 11 years of keeping a chemical plant running safely. And then what? Then their reactor 3 went into emergency shutdown about 13 minutes after my badge stopped working. Sarah's background is in nursing, so she understands systems and procedures and what happens when people don't follow them. How bad? Bad enough that they offered to pay me consulting rates to come back and fix it. I told them to call Consolidated Chemical and book time through my new employer. Her eyes widened. "You took the Consolidated job? I'm calling them tomorrow. They've been trying to recruit me for 2 years. I pulled out my phone and showed her the text thread I'd been having with their engineering director. They pay 40% more than Apex, and they actually value experience over credentials." Sarah smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her in months. "Good for you." My phone started buzzing. Bruce Morrison calling directly. "Russell, I need you to come in right now. We have a plant emergency, and I'm told you're the only one who understands our Reactor 3 control systems." I resigned, Bruce, as of 12:45 today. "I know, but this is bigger than employment issues. We're looking at a potential safety incident and significant product loss. EPA might get involved. Then you need to call a process safety consultant and shut down operations until you understand what went wrong. Jordan says he can fix it if he can just access your procedure files." I almost laughed. Jordan's the one who caused this by overriding safety interlocks. Maybe don't let him make it worse. "Russell, be reasonable. We'll pay you whatever you want. Name your price." "I'm not being unreasonable, Bruce. I'm being professional. You can contract my services through Consolidated Chemical at standard emergency consulting rates. $350 per hour, 40-hour minimum, and I won't touch anything until your insurance company signs off on the safety assessment. That's $14,000 just for the minimum. That's what expertise costs when you don't have it in-house anymore." I hung up. Over the next 2 hours, my phone didn't stop. Mark from the control room. They brought in some consultant from corporate, but he doesn't know our systems. Production's been down for 4 hours. Joe from maintenance. Whatever you did, half the front office is freaking out. Jordan's been in Bruce's office for an hour. At 4:30, Scott Williams tried again. Russell, I'm going to be direct. This shutdown is costing us $200,000 per day in lost production. The batch we lost was worth $800,000. If we can't restart by tomorrow morning, we'll miss delivery commitments that could cost us our biggest customer. Scott, I understand the financial impact, but I'm not your employee anymore. You chose to structure compensation in a way that made it clear my expertise wasn't valued. Now you get to experience what that expertise was worth. This is bigger than a compensation dispute. No, it's exactly a compensation dispute. You told me this morning that Jordan's MBA made him more valuable than my 11 years of operational knowledge. Now you're finding out what happens when that operational knowledge walks away. At 5:45, my phone rang again. This time it was Helen Rodriguez, a board member I'd met once during a plant safety audit. Russell, this is Helen Rodriguez from Sterling's board. I understand there's been a workplace issue that's resulted in a production emergency. There's been a compensation issue that resulted in my resignation, which was followed by a production emergency. I'd like to understand what happened from your perspective. For the first time all day, someone was asking for my side of the story instead of demanding I fix their problem. I told her about the meeting with HR, about Jordan's compensation analysis, about the choice between accepting being undervalued or walking away. And the production incident? Reactor 3 has a known issue with pressure transmitter calibration that I documented in 2019. The fix requires following a specific procedure that accounts for temperature-dependent measurement error. Jordan apparently tried to override the safety systems instead of following the procedure. Why isn't this procedure accessible to the current engineering team? It got stuck in the approval process because Jordan thought it was too reactive instead of proactive. He wanted to focus on digital transformation initiatives instead of maintaining tribal knowledge. There was a long pause. Russell, would you be willing to serve as a technical consultant to help us understand how this situation developed? I start a new job Monday, but I could potentially consult through my new employer. What would that involve? A comprehensive review of your process safety management system, documentation of critical procedures that exist only in institutional knowledge, and recommendations for preventing this type of incident. Probably 2 to 3 weeks of work. And the immediate production issue? That's a separate emergency consulting engagement. You need a qualified process engineer to assess the safety implications of Jordan's interlock override before you restart anything. I can do that work, but it goes through Consolidated Chemical and follows proper emergency response protocols. What's your assessment of the current situation? Honestly, you're probably looking at 3 to 5 days of downtime minimum, plus whatever regulatory review gets triggered by the safety system override. Could be weeks if EPA decides this constitutes a reportable incident. How much will this cost? The immediate emergency response? $14,000 minimum. The broader consulting engagement? Probably $75,000 to $100,000 depending on what we find. That's a lot of money. It's a lot less than what it would have cost to pay me fairly as an employee and avoid this situation entirely. Another pause. Russell, off the record, do you think this could have been prevented? Helen, everything I know about this reactor's quirks and failure modes was documented in procedures that got deprioritized in favor of strategic initiatives. If Jordan had followed existing procedures instead of trying to optimize his way through an emergency, none of this would have happened. Thank you for being direct. I'll be in touch. At 7 p.m., Emily came home from school to find Sarah and me sitting at the kitchen table with her college brochures spread out between us. Why are you home so early, Dad? I quit my job today, I said, and got a better one. Really? Really. Turns out there are companies that pay engineers what they're worth instead of what some MBA thinks they should be worth. Emily grinned. Does this mean I can go to Purdue? It means we can afford Purdue without taking out a second mortgage. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. It wasn't about standing up for myself, I said. It was about professional boundaries. You can't tell someone their expertise doesn't matter and then expect them to save you when that expertise becomes critical. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from Mark. Plant's still down. Word is they're bringing in a whole team of consultants from corporate. This is going to cost them way more than just paying you what you were worth. I showed the text to Sarah. She smiled and shook her head. Expensive lesson, she said. The best kind, I replied. The kind that sticks. 3 days later, I was sitting in Consolidated Chemicals headquarters signing my employment contract when Helen Rodriguez called. Russell, I wanted to give you an update on the situation at Apex. We've completed our initial assessment, and I think you'll find it interesting. I'm listening. Jordan's attempt to override the safety interlocks caused a cascade failure that damaged 2 control valves and corrupted the reactor's calibration data. The repair costs alone are $180,000, and we'll need a full safety system recertification before EPA will let us restart that unit. I winced. How long for recertification? 3 weeks, minimum. Total production loss is projected at $2.8 million. The customer we were producing that batch for has already started procurement discussions with our competitors. What about Jordan? Jordan's no longer with the company as of yesterday. Neither is Linda from HR. Bruce is on administrative leave, pending a full board review of this incident. I set down my pen. Helen, I want to be clear about something. I never intended for anyone to lose their jobs. I just wanted to be paid fairly for my work. I understand. But when someone with strategic decision-making authority makes choices that result in a $2.8 million loss and potential safety violations, there are consequences. This wasn't about revenge, Russell. This was about competence. What happens now? We're implementing several changes. First, we're establishing a technical fellow track that compensates senior engineers based on expertise rather than management responsibilities. Second, we're requiring that all safety-critical procedures be approved by operations personnel, not just management. Third, we're conducting a comprehensive review of compensation equity between technical and management roles. Sounds like the kind of changes that should have happened years ago. Yes, well, sometimes it takes an expensive lesson to get leadership's attention. Which brings me to why I'm calling. We'd like to offer you the position of Senior Technical Fellow for Process Safety. You'd have authority over all safety-critical systems and procedures, with compensation that reflects the value of your expertise. I looked at the consolidated contract in front of me. Helen, I appreciate the offer, but I've already committed to my new employer. I understand. But would you consider taking on the consulting engagement we discussed? Help us rebuild our process safety management system properly? That evening, I sat down with Sarah and Emily to discuss the offer. Emily was excited about the idea of me being recognized as an expert consultant. Sarah was more practical. How long would this consulting project take? She asked. 3 to 4 months, working weekends and evenings. It would be enough to pay for Emily's first 2 years at Purdue outright. And you'd still keep the consolidated job? Absolutely. This would just be weekend consulting work. Sarah smiled. I think you should do it. Not for the money, though that's nice, but because you know how to fix their problems and prevent this from happening to other engineers. 6 months later, I was presenting my final report to Sterling's board of directors. The numbers were sobering. $4.2 million in total costs from the reactor incident, including production losses, repairs, regulatory fines, and consulting fees. More importantly, my review had identified 23 other safety-critical procedures that existed only in the heads of senior operators and engineers. The core issue, I told the board, wasn't technical incompetence. It was institutional arrogance. You had people making decisions about complex systems they didn't understand, while ignoring the expertise of people who did understand them. Helen nodded. What are your recommendations? First, implement mandatory technical competency requirements for anyone with authority over safety systems. Jordan should never have been able to override reactor interlocks without demonstrating he understood the consequences. Second, establish clear career advancement paths for technical experts that don't require moving into management. Third, tie executive compensation to safety metrics, not just production metrics. And fourth, stop hiring people based on where they went to school and start hiring them based on whether they can actually do the job. The presentation went better than I'd expected. 6 weeks later, Sterling implemented every recommendation I'd made. They also established the Patterson Protocol for emergency response situations, a requirement that any override of safety systems had to be approved by someone with direct operational experience on that specific equipment. 2 years later, I was having coffee with Mark Sullivan, who'd been promoted to plant engineering manager under the new technical track system. He'd taken my old job with a 45% salary increase and authority over all process safety decisions. You know what's funny? Mark said. Jordan actually applied to come back last month, said his MBA program didn't prepare him for real operational challenges, and he'd learned a lot about humility. What did you tell him? That we had an opening for a junior process engineer if he was willing to start at the bottom and work his way up by demonstrating actual competence. No management track, no strategic initiatives, just learning how things actually work. Think he'll take it? Mark grinned. He starts Monday. Says he wants to spend 2 years on the floor learning from operators before he touches another control system. I smiled back. Some people do learn, usually not until the cost of not learning becomes too high to ignore. Speaking of learning, did you hear about Bruce? No, what happened to him? He's working for a manufacturing consulting firm now, specializing in operational culture transformation. Apparently, his experience with our incident taught him a lot about the value of institutional knowledge. I laughed. There's a certain justice to that. Yeah. And get this, they hired him specifically because he could speak from experience about what happens when you undervalue technical expertise. As I drove home that evening, I thought about Emily, who was halfway through her sophomore year in Purdue's chemical engineering program. She'd called the night before to tell me about a project where they were studying process safety management systems. Dad, she'd said, my professor used your Sterling consulting case as an example of how institutional knowledge transfer should work. He said the Patterson Protocol is being adopted by chemical companies across the industry. I'd felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with money or recognition. It was the pride that comes from knowing your work made things safer for other people, that the lessons learned from one expensive mistake could prevent similar mistakes elsewhere. The real victory wasn't that I'd gotten fair compensation or that people who'd undervalued me had faced consequences. It was that Emily was studying to become an engineer in an industry where technical expertise was increasingly valued and protected. As I pulled into our driveway, Sarah was waiting on the front porch with 2 cups of coffee. Good meeting? She asked. The best kind, I said. The kind where everyone learned something and nobody had to get hurt for it to happen. She handed me a coffee and smiled. That sounds like the Russell Patterson I married. The one who always believed that doing good work was its own reward. Sometimes, I said, good work gets the reward it deserves. It just takes longer than you think it should. And sometimes, she replied, the reward is bigger than you expected. She was right. The reward wasn't just financial or professional. It was knowing that standing up for the value of expertise had made the entire industry a little bit safer, and that my daughter would enter a profession that had learned to respect the people who actually knew how to keep things running. That was worth more than any MBA could understand. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight the system. It's to let the system teach itself what happens when it loses the people who actually make it work. The best revenge is simply walking away and letting competence speak louder than credentials ever could.